first thing I will be reading in this series is one of my personal favorite pieces. Is by Siobhan Somerville, which is her Scientific Racism and the Invention of the Homosexual Body. It is an excerpt from her book, Queering the Color Line, Race and the Invention of Homosexuality in American Culture. It is, like I said, the first chapter in her book. Siobhan Somerville has an excellent excerpt on the word queer, its use and invention and political nature that sort of separates it from the current use of it as just a synonym for the word gay, which it is not exclusively. That I will likely read maybe next. But like I said, this is one of my personal favorite readings, and so I am beginning here. Queering the Color Line, Race and the Invention of Homosexuality in American Culture by Siobhan B. Somerville. Chapter 1, Scientific Racism and the Invention of the Homosexual Body. I regard sex as the central problem of life, wrote Havelock Ellis in the general preface to the first volume of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, one of the most important texts of the late 19th century medical and scientific discourse on homosexuality in the United States and Europe. Justifying such unprecedented boldness toward the study of sex, Ellis explained, "And now that the problem of religion has practically been settled, and that the problem of labor has at least been placed on a practical foundation, the question of sex, with the racial questions that rest on it, stands before the coming generation as the chief problem for solution." In spite of Ellis's oddly breezy dismissal of the problems of labor and religion, which were far from settled at the time, this passage points suggestively to a link between sexual and racial anxieties. Yet what did Ellis mean by racial questions? More significantly, what was his sense of the relationship between racial questions and the question of sex? Although Ellis himself left these issues unresolved, his elliptical declaration nevertheless suggested that a discourse of race, however elusive, somehow hovered around or within the study of sexuality. This chapter begins with Ellis's provocative linkage between racial questions and the question of sex and explores the various ways in which they were intertwined in late 19th and early 20th century medical literature on sexuality. I focus on expert literature about sexuality, broadly defined to include the writings of physicians, sexologists, and psychiatrists, because it has been integral to the project of situating the quote-unquote invention of homo and heterosexuality historically. Although medical discourse was by no means the only or necessarily the most powerful site of the emergence of new sexual identities, it does nevertheless offer rich resources for understanding the complex development of these sexual categories in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Medical and sexological literature not only became one of the few sites of explicit engagement with questions of sexuality, but also held substantial definitions of power within a culture that sanctioned science to discover and tell the truth about bodies. Previous literary, historical, and theoretical work on the emergence of notions of homosexuality in the late 19th century has drawn primarily on theories and histories of gender. George Chauncey, for instance, has provided an invaluable discussion of the ways in which medical paradigms of sexuality shifted according to changing ideologies of gender between 1880 and 1930. He notes a gradual change in medical models of sexual deviance from a notion of sexual inversion understood as a reversal of one's sex role to a model of homosexuality defined as deviant sexual object choice. These categories and their transformations, argues Chauncey, reflected concurrent shifts in the cultural organization of sex and gender roles and participated in prescribing acceptable behavior, especially within a context of white middle-class gender ideologies. Although gender insubordination offers a powerful explanatory model for the invention of homosexuality, ideologies of gender also, of course, shaped and were shaped by dominant constructions of race. Indeed, although rarely acknowledged, it is striking that the emergence of a discourse on homosexuality in the United States occurred at roughly the same time that the boundaries between quote-unquote black and quote-unquote white were being policed and enforced in unprecedented ways, particularly through institutionalized racial segregation. Although some historians of the scientific discourse on sexuality have included brief acknowledgement of 19th century discourses of racial difference in their work, the particular relationship and potentially mutual effects of discourses on homosexuality and race remain unexplored. This silence may be due in part to the relative lack of explicit attention to race in medical and sexological literature of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These writers did not self-consciously interrogate race, nor were those whose gender insubordination and sexual transgression brought them under the medical gaze generally identified by race on these accounts. Yet the lack of explicit attention to race in these texts does not mean that it was irrelevant to sexologists' endeavors. On the contrary, given the upheaval surrounding racial definition during this period, it is reasonable to claim that these texts were as embedded within contemporary racial ideologies as they were within ideologies of gender. My aim is not to replace a focus on gender with that of race, but rather to understand how discourses of race and gender buttress one another, often competing, often overlapping, in shaping emerging models of homosexuality. I suggest that these structures and methodologies that drove dominant ideologies of race also fueled the pursuit of knowledge about the homosexual body. Both sympathetic and hostile accounts of homosexuality were steeped in assumptions that had driven previous scientific studies of race. My approach is both literary and historical in method, relying on a combination of close reading and contextual analysis. I am particularly interested in the discursive strategies of those who sought to explain and naturalize the categories of quote-unquote black and white, heterosexual, and homosexual. My goal, however, is not to garner and display unequivocal evidence of the direct influence of racial science on those who were developing scientific models of homosexuality. Further, although the texts I study here reproduce the culturally dominant racist ideologies of the 19th century, identifying the racism of these writers as individuals is not the goal of this chapter. Rather, my focus here is on how these writers and thinkers conceptualize sexuality through a reliance on and deployment of racial ideologies that is the cultural assumptions and systems of representation about race through which individuals understood their relationships within the world. I begin with an overview of the history of sexology and scientific racism in the United States. I then suggest three broadly defined ways in which discourses of sexuality seem to have been particularly engaged, sometimes overtly but largely implicitly, with the discourse of scientific racism. All these models constructed both the non-white body and the non-heterosexual body as pathological to greater or lesser extents. Although I discuss these models in separate sections here, they often coexisted despite their contradictions. These models are speculative and are intended as a first step toward understanding the myriad and historically specific ways in which racial and sexual discourses shaped each other at the moment in which medical and scientific discourse articulated a notion of homosexuality. The emergence of sexology in the United States. The field of sexology in the United States developed in conversation with slightly larger earlier developments in Europe, particularly in Germany in the late 19th century. What characterized the growth of sexology as a field was its attempt to wrest authority for diagnosing and defining sexual abnormalities away from juridical discourse and to place it firmly within the purview of medical science. Thus, what was once considered criminal behavior gradually came to be described in terms of disease, as the title of the German sexologist and psychologist Richard von Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis made clear. Same-sex attraction was one of many such sexual pathologies, which included pedophilia, necrophilia, fetishism, sadism, and masochism, among others. Part of Krafft-Ebing's work first appeared in the United States in 1888 when a selection from his Psychopathia Sexualis entitled Perversion of the Sexual Instinct was translated into English and published as an article in an American medical journal. During the 1880s and 1890s, American medical journals also began to devote attention to Urnings and urinism, terms that first had been used by Karl Heinrich Ulrichs in 1964 to describe the model of a female soul in a male body. Another term, contrasexual feeling, adapted from German Sexualempfindung, was first used by Karl von Westphal in 1869 and also began to appear in medical journals of the 1880s and 1890s. Although these texts use differing terms, they shared the assertion that medicine, not law or religion, should be the primary site for determining society's response to those who practice such behaviors. In the 1890s, the work of British sexologist Havelock Ellis became perhaps the most widely influential and authoritative source in American discourses on sexuality. Prominent in the medical community, he was an honorary member of the Chicago Academy of Medicine, a member of the Medical Legal Society of New York, and vice president of the International Medical League and Legal Congress of New York City in 1895. His first work appeared in the United States in 1895 when his article, Sexual Inversion in Women, was published in an American Medical Journal. Apparently the first study of such depth to be published in the United States, this article was included in Ellis's subsequent book, Sexual Inversion, published in the United States in 1900. Initially appearing as the first volume of studies in the psychology of sex, Sexual Inversion became a definitive text in the late 19th century investigations of homosexuality. Despite the series' titular focus in the psychology of sex, Sexual Inversion was a hybrid text. Poised in the methodology between the earlier field of comparative anatomy with its procedures of bodily measurement and the nascent techniques of psychology with its focus on mental development. Like Ulrichs, Krafft-Ebing, and Westphal, Ellis hoped to provide scientific authority for the position that homosexuality should not be considered a crime, but rather a congenital and thus involuntary psychological abnormality. Writing Sexual Inversion in the wake of England's 1885 Labouchere Amendment, which prohibited any act of gross indecency between men, Ellis intended in large part to defend homosexuality from law and public opinion, which in his view combined to place a heavy penal burden and serve a social stigma on the manifestations of an instinct which to those persons who possess it infrequently appears natural and normal. In doing so, Ellis attempted to drape himself in the cultural authority of a naturalist, eager to exert his powers of observation in an attempt to classify and codify his understandings of homosexuality. Ellis's Sexual Inversion gained attention in the United States partly because of the censorship scandal that surrounded it. On publication in England in 1897, Sexual Inversion was judged to be not a scientific work, but a certain lewd, wicked body scandalous libel. Effectively banned in England, subsequent copies were published only in the United States. Yet the importance of Ellis's Sexual Inversion to American understandings of homosexuality lay not only in its reception, but also in Ellis's reliance on American sources for his case studies, many of which were provided by Dr. James Kiernan, then Secretary of the Chicago Academy of Medicine. Although medical and legal practitioners were the primary audience of Sexual Inversion, there is abundant evidence that the book also became an important source for non-expert leaders attempting to find representation of themselves. Written by the American literary critic F.O. Mathiasson to his companion Russell Cheney in the 1920s, for instance, mentioned having read Ellis's works, which apparently had profound effects on Mathiasson's understanding of his own sexuality. For the first time, it was completely brought home that I was what I was by nature. Mathiasson's letter also mentioned that he had marked and checked some passages that struck me particularly in the works of another writer, Edward Carpenter. Not medically trained, but widely influential among sexologists in the United States and Europe, Carpenter, a British socialist, proposed understanding those who had same-sex desires through a medical of intermediate types. Like Ellis's work, though with a significantly different approach, Carpenter's influential essay, The Intermediate Sex, was first published in the United States in 1911. Carpenter, who had long-term sexual relationships with men, offered an idealized model of inverts as intermediate types. on a continuum of male and female characteristics, reversing the pervasive pathologization of homosexuality in medical discourses. Responding to negative characterizations such as Kraft-Ebing's, Carpenter wrote, "Nor does it appear that persons of this class are usually of a gross or especially low type, but if anything, rather quite the opposite, being most refined, sensitive nature." This characterization struck a chord among readers such as Matthiessen, who remarked on the beautiful pictures Carpenter gives of love between men. The early sexological model of inversion prevailed in the United States until the 1920s, when a notion of homosexuality as quote-unquote abnormal sexual object choice emerged. By that time, Sigmund Freud's views on sexuality, which had been widely circulated in the 1910s, began to be popularized. Psychoanalytic discourse defined itself in part through its differences from sexology, which had relied on physiological models. Freud viewed the debates about whether homosexuality was congenital or acquired as specious, and instead argued that homosexuality played a part to differing degrees in everyone's sexuality. Thus, in contrast to the earlier sexologists, he refuted models that set quote-unquote homosexuals apart as a discrete group. Yet, the older model of inverts as a special type did not disappear altogether from either expert or popular discourse. As Eve Sedgwick noted, quote-unquote universalizing models such as Freud's and minoritizing models articulated by Ellis, Kraft-Ebing, and others, while contradictory, have both continued to coexist simultaneously as explanatory frameworks for homosexuality in American culture. Part of the reason that Freud's views did not fully supersede the models of the early sexologists, as my discussion will suggest, may be that minoritizing accounts resonated with and reinforced prevailing American models of racialized bodies. So, psychoanalysis did not incorporate an explicit discourse of race, perhaps intentionally as a response to growing antisemitism in Europe. As Sandra Gilman has suggested, as virtually all of Freud's early disciples were Jews, the lure of psychoanalysis for them may well have been its claims for universalization of human experience and an active exclusion of the importance of race from its theoretical framework. In contrast, with their emphasis on physiological models, sexologists appear to those invested in somatic theories, reinforced in the United States by concurrent discourses about racial differences. It is worth noting here that although my discussion focuses on medical and sexological texts, the delineation of that genre of writing as separate from other spheres is, of course, highly unstable. Despite their claims to scientific objectivity and truth, these writers' investigations were inevitably shaped by contemporary and political cultural ideologies. Further, as Lisa Dalian has demonstrated, some of these writers, particularly Ellis, drew on newspapers and popular accounts for both the quote-unquote data of their work, i.e. case studies, and for the subsequent interpretation of those data. There were considerable overlap between sensationalistic accounts of lady lovers that appeared in newspapers and the supposedly scientific studies of writers like Ellis. Popular and scientific representations should be considered with equal skepticism. Each was inextricable from the ideological biases of the day. 19th century scientific racism. Before returning to my readings of particular sexological studies, it is useful to discuss briefly the history of scientific studies of race in the 19th century. In the United States, the term race has always been contested. In 19th century scientific usage, it might refer to groupings based variously on geography, religion, class, or color. Scientific studies of race before Darwin tended to fall into two general schools of thought, monogeny and polygyny, both of which foregrounded the question of racial origins. Monogeny, which had been the prevailing theory in the 18th century studies of racial difference, held that all of the so-called races were members of the same species and that they had descended from common ancestry. racial differences were thought to be caused primarily by environmental conditions. Conveniently, monogynous theory meshed with the standard Christian origin narrative, in which, at the moment of the fall of the in the Garden of Eden, humankind had begun to disperse and degenerate into multiple races from a single original source represented by Adam and Eve. Some proponents of this theory of degeneration believed that these differences were fixed and irreversible. Others held that degeneration might be reversed in appropriate climates. Although monogenists emphasize environmental factors as the key explanation for racial differences, it is important to emphasize that monogenists do not generally advocate racial equality. Samuel Stanhope Smith, a major authority among monogenists, held that whites were the pure and original race from which others had degenerated. His ideas, developed primarily in his essay on the cases of the variety of complexion and figure in the human species, first published in 1787, held sway until the 1830s. The other major theory of racial origins, polygyny, held that different races were actually different species with distinct biological and geographic origins. Although theories of polygenesis had begun to be developed in the early 19th century, it was not until the 1840s and 1850s that this view came to be accepted widely among scientists. Polygyny was a predominantly American theoretical development, and was widely referred to as the American School of Anthropology. As George Fredrickson has pointed out, the emergence and greater acceptance of polygenesis rather than monogenesis among scientists during these decades cannot be divorced from political and cultural debates about slavery in the United States. The full scientific assault on environmentalism came at a time when it was bound to have some influence on the discussion of slavery and Negro protests. Polygenists such as Samuel George Morton, Josiah Nott, and Louis Agassiz held that blacks were permanently inferior to whites and that racial mixture would have dangerous social and biological consequences. According to the polygenist model, the mulatto was a hybrid that would eventually die out of existence. However, they differed. Adherents to both polygyny and monogamy nevertheless shared many epistemological assumptions and relied on the same empiricist methodologies, comparative anatomy, and anthropometry. Behind these anatomical measurements lay the assumption that the body was a legible text with various keys or languages available for reading its symbolic codes. In the logic of biological determinism, the surface and interior of the individual body, rather than its social characteristics, such as language, behavior, or clothing, became the primary sites of its meaning. Every peculiarity of the body has probably some corresponding significance in the mind, and the causes of the former are remoter causes of the latter, wrote Edward Drinker Cope, a well-known American paleontologist, summarizing the assumptions that fueled science of comparative anatomy. Although scientists debated which particular anatomical features carried racial meanings, skin, facial angle, pelvis, skull, brain mass, genitalia, the theory that anatomy predicted intelligence and behavior remained remarkably consistent. As Nancy Stepan and Sandra Gilman have noted, the concepts within racial science were so congruent with social and political life, with power relations, that is, as to be virtually uncontested from the inside the mainstream of science. Supported by the cultural authority of an ostensibly objective scientific method, these readings of the body became a powerful instrument for those seeking to justify the economic and political disenfranchisement of various racial groups within systems of slavery and colonialism. As Barbara Fields has noted, however, try as they would, the scientific racists of the past failed to discover any objective criterion upon which to classify people. To their chagrin, every criterion they tried varied more within so-called races than between them. Although the methods of science were considered to be outside the political and economic realm, in fact, as we know, these anatomical investigations, however professedly innocent in their intentions, were driven by racial ideologies already firmly in place. With the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859, prevailing theories of polygyny had to be reformulated in the light of the theory of evolution. Darwin's controversial innovation was an emphasis on the continuity between animals and human beings. Evolutionary theory held out the possibility that the physical, mental, and moral characteristics of human beings had evolved gradually over time from ape-like ancestors. Although the idea of continuity depended logically on the blurring of boundaries within hierarchies, it did not necessarily invalidate the methods of comparative anatomy or polygenist theories. The Darwinian model might seem to contradict the belief that different races originated separately, but believers in polygyny modified their theories to make them compatible with evolutionary models. Thus, they argued that blacks were an incipient species, holding that there had been no racial progress or intellectual development of blacks in recorded history, and that, by the tenets of natural selection, blacks remained biologically inferior. Evolutionary theory also tended to reinforce the notion of racial hierarchies through the method of ranking and ordering bodies according to stages of evolutionary progress. The theory of recapitulation, often summed up by the phrase ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, emerged as a crucial concept, holding that in its individual maturation, each organism proceeds through stages that are equivalent to adult forms of organisms that have preceded it in evolutionary development. Thus, the children of the superior groups embodied phases equivalent to the mature adults' phases of inferior groups. Importantly, analogies between gender and race structured the logic of hierarchical rankings of bodies. According to the logic of recapitulation, adult African Americans and white women were at the same stage as white male children, and therefore represented at an ancestral stage in the evolution of adult white males. These types of analogies had already been mobilized earlier in the 19th century by comparative anatomists such as Carl Vogt, who in his study of brains argued that the grown-up Negro partakes, as regards his intellectual faculties, the nature of the child, the female, and the senile white. As Robin Wiegman comments, such an analogy simultaneously differentiated and linked two of the 19th century's primary forms of social difference, instantiating and perpetuating the visible economies of race and gender by locating their signification on bodies that could not claim the disembodied abstraction accorded those both white and male. These powerful analogies that structure the theory of recapitulation, as I will show, became crucial for later characterizations of homosexuality. Visible differences: sexology and comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy, which had been the chief methodology of 19th century racial science, gave sexologists a ready-made set of procedures and assumptions with which to scan the body visually for discrete markers of difference. Race, in fact, became an explicit, though ambiguous, structural element in Ellis's sexual inversion. In Chapter 5, entitled The Nature of Sexual Inversion, Ellis attempted to collate the evidence contained in his collection of case studies, dividing his general conclusions into various analytic categories. Significantly, race was the first category he listed, under which he wrote, "All my cases, 80 in number, are British and American, 20 living in the United States and the rest being British. Ancestry, from the point of view of race, was not made a matter of special investigation." He then listed the ancestries of the individuals whose cases he included, which he identified as English, Scotch, Irish, German, French, Portuguese, and more or less Jewish. He concluded, except in the apparently frequent presence of the German element, there is nothing remarkable in this ancestry. Ellis used the term race in this passage interchangeably with national origin, with the possible exception of Jewish identity. These national identities were perceived to be at least partially biological and certainly hereditary in Ellis's account, though subordinate to the categories British and American. Although he dismissed ancestry from the point of view of race as a significant category, its place as the first topic within the chapter suggests its importance to the structure of Ellis's analysis. As scholars such as Nancy Steppen, Wanda Scheibinger, and Sandra Gilman have pointed out, scientific assertions about racial difference were often articulated through gender. Gilman has commented, any attempt to establish that the races were inherently different rested to no little extent on the sexual difference of the black. This association was made not only in scientific discourses but also in popular racist mythology as well. However, although 19th century American popular cultural forms such as blackface minstrelsy focused on the supposed differences between the African American and white men's genitalia, the male body was not necessarily the primary site of medical inquiry into racial difference. Instead, as a number of medical journals from the 1870s demonstrate, comparative anatomists repeatedly located racial difference to the sexual characteristics of the female body. In exploring the influence of scientific studies of race on the emerging discourse of sexuality, it is useful to look closely at a study from the genre of comparative anatomy. In 1867, W. H. Flower and James Murray published an account of the dissection of a bushwoman, in which carefully catalogued the more perishable soft structures of the body of a young bushwoman. They placed their study in a line of inquiry concerning the African woman's body that had begun at least half a century later with French naturalist George Cuvier's description of the woman particularly known as the quote-unquote Hottentot Venus, or Sarti Bartman, who is displayed to European audience fascinated by her stadiopygia, or protruding buttocks. Significantly, starting with Cuvier, this tradition of comparative anatomy located the boundaries of race through the sexual and reproductive anatomy of the African female body, ignoring altogether the problematic absence of male bodies from these studies. Flower and Murray's account lingered on two specific sites of difference: the protuberance of the buttocks, so peculiar to the Bushman race, and the remarkable development of the labia minora, which were, quote, sufficiently well marked to distinguish these parts from those of any ordinary varieties of the human species, end quote. The racial difference of the African body implied for Flower and Murray was located in its literal excess, a specifically sexual excess that placed her body outside the boundaries of the quote-unquote normal female. To support their conclusion, Flower and Murray included corroborating quote-unquote evidence in the final part of their account. They quoted a second-hand report, quote, received from a scientific friend residing at the Cape of Good Hope, end quote, describing the anatomy of, quote, two purebred Hottentots, mother and daughter, end quote. This account also focused on the women's genitalia, which they referred to as appendages. Although their account ostensibly foregrounded the boundaries of race, their portrayal of the sexual characteristics of the bushwoman betrayed Flower and Murray's anxiety about gender boundaries, a characteristic singled out as, quote, peculiar to this race, and quote-unquote peculiar to this race, the double appendages fluttered between genders, at one moment masculine, at the next exaggeratedly feminine. Flower and Murray constructed the site of racial difference by marking the sexual and reproductive anatomy of the African woman as quote-unquote peculiar. In their characterization, sexual ambiguity delineated the boundaries of race. Sexologists writing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries inherited this tendency to racialize perceived sexual ambiguity, but they used a new framework to interpret its meaning. Producing data, their newly created object of study, the invert, they also routinely included physical examinations in their account, reproducing the methodologies employed by comparative anatomists such as Flower and Woory. Many of the case histories in Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis, for instance, included a paragraph detailing any anatomical peculiarities of the body in question. Krafft-Ebing could not draw any conclusions about the somatic indicators of quote-unquote abnormal sexuality, but physical examinations nevertheless remained a staple of the genre. In Ellis's Sexual Inversion, as I will show, case studies often focus more intently on the bodies of female quote-unquote inverts than those of their male counterparts. Although the specific sites of anatomical inspection, hymen, clitoris, labia, vagina, differed in various sexological texts, the underlying theory remained constant. Women's genitalia and reproductive anatomy held a valuable and presumably visual key to ranking bodies according to the norms of sexuality. Sexologists reproduced not only the methodologies of comparative anatomy of races, but also its iconography. One of the most consistent medical characterizations of the anatomy of both African American women and lesbians was the myth of an unusually large clitoris. As late as 1921, medical journals contained articles declaring that a physical examination of female homosexuals will in practically every instance disclose an abnormally prominent clitoris. Significantly, this author added, "This is particularly so in colored women." In an earlier account of racial differences between white and African American women, one gynecologist had also focused on the size and visibility of the clitoris. In his examinations, he had perceived a distinction between the free clitoris of negresses and the imprisonment of the clitorises in Aryan American women. In constructing these oppositions, such characterizations literalized the sexual and racial ideologies of the 19th century cult of true womanhood, which explicitly privileged white women's sexual quote-unquote purity, while implicitly suggesting African American women's sexual accessibility. Like the studies of comparative anatomists, the case histories in Ellis's Sexual Inversion differed markedly according to gender and the amount and degree of attention given to the examination of anatomical details. Quote, "As regards the sexual origins, it seems possible," Ellis wrote, "so far as my observations go, to speak more definitely of inverted women than inverted men." End quote. Ellis justified his more zealous inspection of women's bodies in part by invoking the ambiguity surrounding women's sexuality in general. Quote, "We are accustomed to a much greater familiarity and intimacy between women than men, and we are less apt to suspect the existence of any abnormal passion." End quote. To Ellis, the seemingly imperceptible differences between abnormal and normal intimacies between women called for greater scrutiny into the subtleties of their anatomy. He included the following detailed account as potential evidence for understanding the fine line between the female invert and the normal woman. Sexual organs. A. Internal. Uterus and ovaries appear normal. B. External. Small clitoris with this irregularity that the lower folds of the labia minora, instead of uniting one with the other and forming the frenum, are extended upward along the sides of the clitoris, while the upper folds are poorly developed, furnishing the clitoris with a scant hood. The labia majora depart from normal conformation in being fuller in their posterior half than in their anterior part, so that when the subject is in the supine position they sag, as it were, presenting a slight resemblance to fleshy sacs, but in substance and structure they feel normal. This extraordinary taxonomy performed for Ellis by an unnamed, quote, obstetric physician of high standing, end quote, echoed earlier anatomical catalogs of African women. The the exacting eye and hand of the investigating physician highlighted every single possible detail as meaningful evidence. Through the triple repetition of normal and the use of evaluative language such as irregularity and poorly developed, the physician reinforced his position of judgment. Without providing criteria for what constituted normal anatomy, the physician simply proclaimed irregularity based on his own powers of sight and touch. Moreover, his characterization of what he perceived as abnormal echoed the anxious account by Flower and Murray. Although the description of the clitoris in this account is a notable exception to the tendency to exaggerate its size, the account nevertheless scrutinized another side of genital excess. The, quote, fleshy sex, unquote, of this woman, like the, quote-unquote, appendages fetishized in the earlier account, invoked the anatomy of a phantom male body inhabiting the lesbian's anatomical features. The attention given to the apparent gender binary ambiguity in these accounts took on specific significance in the context of evolutionary theory. One of the basic assumptions within the Darwinian model was the belief that, as organisms evolved through a process of natural selection, they also showed greater signs of sexual differentiation. Following this logic, various writers use sexual characteristics as indicators for evolutionary progress towards civilization. In Man and Woman, for instance, Ellis himself cautiously suggested that since the beginnings of industrialism, more marked sexual differences in physical development seem, we cannot speak definitely, to have developed than are usually to be found in savage societies. In articulating this idea, Ellis drew from theories developed by biologists such as Patrick Geddes and J. Arthur Thompson, who stated in their important work, The Evolution of Sex, that hermaphroditism is primitive, the unisexual state is a subsequent differentiation. The present cases of normal hermaphroditism imply either persistence or reversion. In characterizing either lesbians or African American women's bodies as less sexually differentiated than the norm, always posited as white heterosexual women's bodies, anatomists and sexologists drew on the notions of natural selection to dismiss these bodies as anomalous throwbacks within a scheme of cultural and anatomical progress. Eugenics, sexology, and the mixed body. Evolutionary assumptions played a significant role in the development of eugenics, a form of racial science explicitly entwined with questions of sexuality and reproduction. Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, introduced and defined the term eugenics in his inquiries into human faculty and its development in 1883 as the cultivation of race and the science of improving stock, which takes cognizance of all influence that tend in however remote a degree to give to the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. In the United States, eugenics advocated selective reproduction and race hygiene, a political and scientific response to the growth of a population beginning to challenge the dominance of white political interests. The widespread scientific and social interest in eugenics was fueled by anxieties expressed through the popularized notion of the white race suicide. This phrase, invoked most famously by Theodore Roosevelt, summed up nativist fears about a perceived decline in production among white Americans. This new field of eugenics worked hand in hand with growing anti-miscegenation sentiment and policy, provoked not only by attempts for political representation among African Americans, but also by the influx of large populations of immigrants. As Mark Haller has pointed out, racist and immigration restriction is found in eugenics the scientific reassurances they needed that heredity shaped man's personality and that their assumptions rested on biological facts. As American culture became increasingly racially segregated at the turn of the century, the figure of the mulatto carried contradictory meanings in relation to the discourse of eugenics and the larger field of racial science. Edward Byron Ritter's The Mulatto in the United States, for instance, pursued an exhaustive, quantitative, and comparative study of the mulatto population and its achievements in relation to those of pure white or African ancestry. Ritter traced the presence of a distinct group of mixed-race people back to early American history. Their physical appearance, though markedly different from that of the pure-blooded race, was sufficiently marked to set them off as a peculiar people. Ritter, of course, was willing to admit the viability of mulattoes only within a framework that emphasized the separation of races. Far from using the notion of the biracial body to refute the belief in discrete markers of racial difference, Ritter perpetuated the notion by focusing on the distinctiveness of this peculiar people. In contrast, others denied any positive or neutral effects of race mixture, arguing that any intermixture was a threat to white purity. Charles Davenport, who dominated the early eugenic movement in the United States, claimed that miscegenation commonly spells disharmony of physical, mental, and temperamental qualities. A hybridized people are a badly put together people of dissatisfied, restless, ineffective people. The mulatto, as an embodiment of the object of eugenist efforts, also became an important, if contradictory, figure in sexologists' attempts to characterize the sexual invert. In its emphasis on sexual reproduction, eugenics was tied to the concerns of sexology, even though most eugenicists did not generally emphasize questions of homosexuality. Sexologists, however, invoked the concerns of eugenics in pathologizing homosexuality. William Robertson, a doctor who was a prominent sexologist and editor of 2 medical journals concerning sex research, used the unmistakable rhetoric of eugenics to describe homosexuality. In 1914, in an article entitled My Views on Homosexuality, he wrote that he considered homosexuality a sign of degeneracy and that it was a sad, deplorable, pathological phenomenon. Every sexual deviation or disorder which has for its result an inability to perpetuate the race is ipso facto pathologic, ipso facto an abnormality, and this is preeminently true of homosexuality. End quote. Some sexologists who developed models of homosexuality also participated directly in the eugenics movement. Elsa's sense of the racial questions inherent in sex, for instance, was surely informed by his own involvement with eugenics. On behalf of the British National Council for Public Morals, Ellis wrote several essays concerning eugenics, including The Problem of Race Regeneration, a pamphlet advocating voluntary sterilization of the unfit as a policy in the best interest of the race. He was also active in the Eugenics Education Society in England. Further, in a letter to Francis Galton in 1907, Ellis wrote, "In the concluding volume of my sex studies, I shall do what I can to insinuate the eugenic attitude." The beginnings of sexology, then, circulated within and perhaps depended on a pervasive climate of eugenicist and anti-miscegenation sentiment and legislation. Even at the level of nomenclature, anxieties about miscegenation shaped sexologists' attempts to find an appropriate and scientific name for the newly visible object of their study. Introduced into English through the 1892 translation of Krafft Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis, the term heterosexuality stimulated a great deal of uneasiness. In the 1915 edition of Sexual Inversion, Ellis reported that most investigators have been much puzzled in coming to a conclusion as to the best, most exact, and at a time most colorless names for same-sex desire. Giving an account of the various names proposed, such as Ulrich's Uranian and Westpol's contrary sexual feeling, Ellis admitted that homosexuality was the most widely used term. Far from the ideal colorless term, however, homosexuality evoked Ellis's distaste for its mixed origins. In a regretful aside, he noted that it has philologically the awkward disadvantage of being a bastard term compounded of Greek and Latin elements. In the first edition of Sexual Inversion, Ellis stated his alarm more directly. Homosexual is a barbarously hybrid word. A similar view was expressed by Edward Carpenter, who, like Ellis, winced at the connotations of illegitimacy at the word homosexual. Generally used in scientific works, it is of course a bastard word. Homogenic has been suggested as being from two roots, both Greek, i.e. homos, same, and genos, sex. Carpenter's suggestion, of course, resonated both against and within vocabularies of eugenics and miscegenation. Performing these etymological gyrations with almost comic literalism, Ellis and Carpenter expressed pervasive cultural anxieties about questions of racial origins and purity. Concerned above all else with legitimacy, they attempted to remove and rewrite the mixed origins of homosexuality. Ironically, despite their suggestions for alternatives, the bastard term took hold among sexologists, thus yoking together, at least rhetorically, two kinds of mixed bodies, the racial hybrid and the invert. Although Ellis exhibited anxieties about biracial bodies, for others who sought to naturalize and recuperate homosexuality, the evolutionary emphasis on continuity in the figure of the mulatto offered potentially useful analogies. Edward Stevenson, who wrote pseudonymously as Xavier Mayne, one of the earliest American advocates of homosexual rights, stated, quote, "Between whitest of men and the blackest Negro stretches out a vast line of intermediary races as to their colors, brown, olive, red, tawny, yellow," end quote. He then invoked this model of race to envision a continuous spectrum of gender and sexuality. Nature abhors the absolute, delights in the fractional, intersexes express the half-steps, the between beings. In this analogy, Mayne reversed the dominant cultural hierarchies that privileged purity over mixture. Drawing on irrefutable evidence of the natural existence of biracial people, Mayne posited a direct analogy to a similarly mixed body, the intersex, which he positioned a necessary presence within the natural order. Despite Carpenter's complaint about bastard terminology, he, like Mayne, also occasionally appropriated the scientific language of racial mixing in order to resist this association between homosexuality and degeneration. In the intermediate sex, Carpenter attempted to theorize homosexuality outside of the discourse of pathology or abnormality. He too suggested a continuum of genders, with intermediate types occupying a place between the poles of exclusively heterosexual male and female. In an appendix to the intermediate sex, Carpenter offered a series of quotations supporting his ideas, some of which drew on racial analogies. Quote, "Anatomically and mentally, we all find shades existing from the pure genus man to the pure genus woman. Thus there has been constituted what is well named by an illustrious exponent of the science the third sex. As we are continually meeting in cities women who are 1/4 or 1/8 or so on male, so there are the inner self similar half-breeds, all adapting themselves to circumstances with perfect ease." End quote. Through notions of shades of gender and sexual half-breeds, Carpenter appropriated dominant scientific models of race to construct and embody what he called the intermediate sex. The analogy between the sexual invert and the mixed racial body was thus immobilized in contradictory rays with sexological discourse. It could exhibit this body as evidence of either degeneration or of a legitimate place within natural order. Sexual perversion and racialized desire. By the early 20th century, medical models of sexuality had begun to shift and incorporate a notion of homosexuality based on sexual object choice rather than inversion. It seems significant that this shift took place within a period that also saw a transformation of scientific notions about race. As historians have suggested, in the early 20th century, scientific claims for exclusively biological models of racial difference were beginning to be undermined by scientists such as Franz Boas, although, of course, these models have persisted in popular understandings of race. In what ways were these shifts away from biological notions of sexuality and race related in scientific literature? One area in which they overlapped and perhaps shaped one another was through models of interracial and homosexual desire. Whereas previously two bodies, mulatto and the invert, had been linked together in a visual economy, now two taboo types of desire, interracial and homosexual, became linked in sexological and psychological discourse through the mode of abnormal sexual object choice. This convergence of theories of perverse racial and sexual desire is evidenced in the assumptions of psychologists such as Margaret Otis, whose analysis of A Perversion Not Commonly Noted appeared in a medical journal in 1913. Otis noted that in all-girl institutions, including reform schools and boarding schools, she had observed widespread lovemaking between white and colored girls. Otis's explicit discussion of racial difference and homosexuality was relatively rare among the burgeoning medical literature on sexuality in the early 20th century. Both fascinated and alarmed, Otis remarked that this perversion was well known in reform schools and institutions for delinquent girls, but that this particular form of the homosexual relation has perhaps not been brought to the attention of scientists. End quote. Performing her ostensible duty to science, Otis carefully described the rituals of interracial romance in the girl's peculiar moral code. In particular, she noted that the girls incorporated racial difference into courtship rituals self-consciously patterned on traditional gender rules. One white girl admitted that the colored girl she loved seemed the man, and thought it was so the case of the others. In Otis's account, the actions of the girls clearly threatened keepers of the institutions, who responded to the perceived danger with efforts to racially segregate their charges, who were, of course, already segregated by gender. Otis, however, left open the motivation for segregation. Did the girls' intimacy trouble the authorities because it was homosexual or because it was interracial? Otis avoided exploring this question and offered a succinct theory instead. The difference in color in this case takes place of the difference in sex. She used a simple analogy between race and gender to understand their desire. Black was to white as masculine was to feminine. Racial difference performed an important visual function in Otis's account. In turn of the century American culture, where Jim Crow segregation erected a structure of taboos against any kind of public, non-work related interracial relationship, racial difference visually marks the alliances between schoolgirls as anomalous and therefore the object of scientific scrutiny. In a culture in which Ellis could remark that he was accustomed to women being on intimate terms, race became a marker for the sexual nature of that liaison. As Catherine Hinojosa Baker has noted, had the lovemaking been intraracial rather than interracial, Otis might not have seen any need to write an article detailing these relationships. Race makes the situation notable. In effect, the institution of racial segregation and its cultural fiction of black and white produced a framework in which the girls' interracial romances became legible as perverse. Otis's account also demonstrated the ways in which the color line was fundamentally eroticized in the early 20th century. We might recall here the supposed need for racial segregation, as it was formalized by the Plessy versus Ferguson case in the 1890s, was articulated through a discourse of panic about sexual mobility. One strategy was to demonize all black men as a sexual threat to white women. As an editorial in a Louisiana newspaper in favor of racially segregated train cars put it, quote, "A man that would be horrified at the idea of his wife or daughter seated by the side of a burly Negro in the parlor of a hotel or at a restaurant cannot see her occupying a crowded in a car next to a Negro without the same feeling of disgust. The assumption driving this reasoning reveals a racial fantasy inextricably tied to the logic of compulsory heterosexuality. Both legalized and de facto racial segregation serve not only to demand constant adherence to the fictions of racial identity, but to police sexual mobility. In the context of the all-girls reform schools, this eroticization of the color line remained in force from both Otis's perspective and perhaps those of the girls themselves. Otis's case reveals the imposition of segregation marked the white and colored girls as differently gendered, even in a space of a supposedly single-sex institution. Otis's statement that the difference in color in this case takes the place of difference in sex resonates with recent critical discussions of lesbian desire and identification, which have invoked similar analogies between the visual function of butch femme roles and racial difference. For instance, film critic Ruby Rich has suggested that racial difference operates for lesbians in the same way as, let's say, butch femme or S&M roles do, as a form of differentiation between two people of the same gender. Elsewhere, Rich has speculated that race occupies the place vacated by gender. The non-sameness of color, language, or culture is a marker of difference in relationships otherwise defined by the sameness of gender. Commenting on Rich's analysis, however, Biddy Martin points out that race does not operate just like butch femme. It also operates to secure butch femme roles. Although it is important to emphasize that butch femme as a particular construction of lesbian desire is anachronistic in the context of Otis's article, Martin's comments point usefully to an analysis of the scopic function of racial difference in this account. Martin adds, making lesbian desire as visible as desire rather than identification requires an added measure of difference figured racially. Thus, within prevailing models that assume that sexual desire depended on difference, homosexual desire was made legible through the girl's transgression of the color line. It is also possible that a corollary process was at work in Otis's account, that the figure of the color line itself instantiated desire, regardless of gender. Otis admitted that the separation seemed to enhance the value of the loved one, that she was to a degree inaccessible, added to her charms. Regarding a different historical and cultural context, that of 19th century Orientalist painting, art historian Linda Nochlin has asserted that the conjunction of black and white or dark and light female bodies, whether naked or in the guise of mistress and maidservant, traditionally signified lesbianism. Although Nochlin does not elaborate further on this assertion, it resonates with Otis's account of the American institution. The proximity of white and colored girls attracted the pathologizing gaze of Otis's clinical eye and made this particular form of the homosexual relation worth noting. The discourse of sexual pathology in turn seems to have formed scientific understandings of race as well. In 1903, for instance, a Southern physician drew on the language of sexology to legitimate a particularly racist fear. A perversion from which most races are exempt prompts the Negro's inclinations towards the white woman, whereas other races incline toward the females of their own. Using the medical language of perversion to nationalize and legitimate the dominant cultural myth of the black rapist, this account characterized interracial desire as a type of congenital abnormal sexual object choice. In the writer's terms, the desire of African American men for white women, though not the desire of white men for African American women, could be understood and pathologized by drawing on emergent models of sexual orientation. This chapter has focused on the various ways in which late 19th century and early 20th century scientific discourses on race provided a logic through which sexologists and other medical quote-unquote experts articulated emerging models of homosexuality in the United States. These interconnections fall into three broad areas: Methodologies and iconographies of comparative anatomy attempted to locate discrete physiological markers of difference by which to classify and separate races. Sexologists drew on these techniques to try to position the homosexual body as anatomically distinguishable from the normal body. Likewise, medical discourses on sexuality appear to have been steeped in pervasive cultural anxieties about mixed bodies, particularly the mulatto, whose symbolic position as a mixture of black and white bodies was literalized in scientific accounts. Sexologists and others writing about homosexuality borrowed the model of the racially mixed body as a way to make sense of the invert, an individual who appeared to be neither completely masculine or completely feminine. Finally, racial and sexual discourses converged in the psychological models that understood unnatural desire as perversion. In these cases, interracial and same-sex sexuality became analogous within later conceptions of sexual object choice. As in Otis's account, the proximity of white and colored bodies under segregation elicited expert scrutiny and provided a visual marker of transgressive sexual desire. At about the same time that the first articles on sexual inversion appeared in medical journals in the United States, experiments with a new visual technology, the cinema, were just beginning to change the landscape of American popular culture. In April 1896, the first public exhibitions of Thomas Edison's Vitascope, which projected motion pictures upon a white screen in a darkened hall, took place in New York City. Although expert discourses on sexuality and race asserted enormous cultural authority during this time, as the new medium of cinema emerged in the next 3 decades, it would also hold increasing power to shape cultural assumptions about the visibility and racial identities, about the visibility of sexual and racial identities. As the next chapter will explore, racial and sexual discourses became deeply intertwined in the popular imagination as the new medium reinforced and reinterpreted scientific emphasis on the visualization and embodiment of racial and sexual identities. Thank you for listening to me struggle through those 11 or so pages. I apologize for the many, many words that I mispronounced. I'm going to scroll through the sources here in case you're interested in any of them. Hopefully I don't go too fast, but there's she lists quite a few sources as necessary for this kind of thing. As I said, this is one of my favorite readings because it makes clear the ways that, as a black lesbian, it makes clear the ways that sexuality and race are really intertwined, in the ways that people think about sexuality and race are intertwined. And so that's kind of just my personal take on it. I will hopefully be doing a video analyzing this, although that would likely be pretty long, so we'll see what happens. But thank you so much for listening.